The glass walls of the boardroom shimmered like a fishbowl, trapping me in full view of every pair of eyes inside. I sat at the oval steel table, notebook open, pen balanced in my hand, prepared to walk the executives through the final draft of the cross-border alliance proposal. Before I could speak, Richard Dempsey, our CEO, swept in with the energy of a man about to stage a performance. At his side was a younger man, his navy suit too polished, his grin too wide. "Everyone," Richard announced, voice booming against the walls. "Meet my nephew, Brandon. He'll be stepping into Laura Price's role, effective immediately. A new generation, fresh perspective." His words sliced the air clean. The pen slid slightly in my grip, though my hand didn't shake. 16 years of midnight flights, endless negotiations, and fragile trust balanced on translation dissolved in a single sentence. Brandon strutted forward, eager to shake hands, his laugh bouncing awkwardly. Too loud for the gravity of the room. Applause followed, not spontaneous, but practiced, like actors following stage directions. "Let me turn to you. When was the last time you drank a full glass of water without rushing? Do it now. Tell me, where are you watching from tap? Like and subscribe if you've ever felt replaced in a space you once built with your own hands." Then came the blow I hadn't braced for. An HR assistant slipped through the side door carrying a cardboard box, already labeled with my name. Inside lay my belongings, the ceramic mug from Singapore, the leather notebook I carried to Dubai, and a silver frame holding a photograph of me with the Madrid partners, our smiles hard-won after 12 hours of negotiation. To see it tossed into a box felt like being erased while still sitting in the chair. This was no sudden decision. They had prepared my removal in advance. Across from me, Mark, one of the few colleagues I trusted, leaned forward. His lips parted, the faint sound of protest forming. But then Richard's gaze found him icy, unblinking, a warning sharp enough to cut him silent. Mark closed his mouth, eyes dropping to the table, shoulders folding inward. I stood, gripping the pen like a fragile anchor, and gathered the box in my arms. The room went quiet, every breath heavy with theater. I didn't fight, didn't plead. The humiliation was sharper than any words I could have offered. My legacy was still on those documents. Yet here I was, escorted out like a ghost no one dared to name. The office felt different once the announcement was over. The same corridors I had walked for 16 years now seemed narrower, the carpet thinner, every step echoing in a way it never had before. My desk sat at the far end of the floor, tucked against the window overlooking the river. It had always been my anchor, the place where deals began and ended. Now it was a stage for my exit. A cardboard box waited on the edge of the desk, its flaps already open. I slid open the top drawer, my fingers brushing across the pens, highlighters, and travel receipts collected from 100 flights across continents. Each item carried a memory. Each one reminded me of the time I had sacrificed, the birthdays missed, the nights awake in foreign hotels while working through translations. I placed them inside the box carefully, as if arranging the pieces of a life into a coffin. At the back of the drawer, folded neatly in a protective sleeve, I found the letter. I knew the handwriting instantly. Years earlier, after the Madrid negotiation, the 12-hour marathon that nearly collapsed 3 times before it broke through, one of the senior partners had written to me, "Laura, you are more than a negotiator. We trust you like family." Their words had been my quiet source of strength whenever I doubted myself. I traced the ink with my thumb, feeling the sincerity pressed into every stroke. Now, in this moment of exile, the letter felt heavier than paper. It felt like proof that my work had meant something to someone, even if my own company wanted to forget me. Beneath the letter was another relic, a stack of older documents. One page slipped free, carrying Richard Dempsey's unmistakable signature. My breath caught. It was the original agreement containing the bilingual clause, the safeguard I had designed years ago to ensure accuracy and prevent fraud. All agreements executed in translation must carry validation from the original drafter. Laura Price. Richard had signed it without hesitation back then, treating it as a minor technicality. He never understood the power of language. He never understood that words could be both bridge and blade. I held the document in my hands. The ink faded, but still binding. My name stared back at me, quietly alive inside a contract they no longer remembered. For the first time that morning, I felt less erased, forgotten by the company. Maybe, but not powerless. A voice startled me. It was Dana, one of the few colleagues who had stood by me in the early years. She leaned on the partition, arms crossed, eyes filled with pity. "Laura," she said gently, "don't hold on to this. It's over. Sometimes the smartest thing is to walk away quietly." Her words stung more than Richard's announcement. Coming from him, betrayal was expected. From her, it was surrender disguised as kindness. I wanted to argue, to tell her the letter from Madrid, the clause. The countless nights I had invested were proof that walking away wasn't always the answer, but I didn't. I only nodded, sliding the papers back into the box. She gave me a sad smile before drifting away, as if she were relieved not to be standing too close to a falling figure. I sat in the empty chair one last time, the river glinting through the glass beyond. The office buzzed faintly around me, phones ringing, keyboards clattering, but it all seemed muffled, distant, like a world I no longer belonged to. Isolation had a sound. It was the absence of your name being spoken in a place you had given everything to. I closed the flaps of the cardboard box, sealing inside the artifacts of 16 years. My hands rested on top for a moment longer, steady but heavy, as if they needed permission to let go. Then I stood, lifting the weight into my arms, and walked down the hallway. No one stopped me. No one said goodbye. And that, I realized, was the cruelest cut of all. Brandon arrived at the office the next morning, like a man stepping onto a stage he didn't earn. I had seen overconfident hires before, but his stride carried a different arrogance. It was inherited, not learned. His navy suit looked custom-made, his tie clipped just right, but no amount of tailoring could disguise the hollowness in his eyes. From the window of the lobby cafe, where I lingered with my cardboard box still in the back seat of my car, I watched him shake hands with people who once reported to me. Some were polite out of survival, others smiled too brightly, masking discomfort with forced enthusiasm. They all knew he hadn't earned the role. Still, they clapped him on the back, offered congratulations, and played their parts in the charade Richard had orchestrated. Later, clips of Brandon's official introduction circulated online. Richard had staged a press event in the atrium, cameras flashing under banners proclaiming a new era for Nordcrest. Brandon stood at the podium with the posture of a man reading from a script he didn't understand. He introduced himself as the company's bridge to global expansion, his voice overly confident, the rehearsed cadence falling flat in places where sincerity should have lived. And then came the moment that exposed him. In a section about our Dubai partners, he mangled a key Arabic term, replacing a word that meant strategic trust with one that meant seasonal commodity. The room paused. Some executives shifted uncomfortably, hoping no one else caught it. But the Dubai delegation, attending virtually, exchanged quick glances. Their expressions were polite but stiff. I knew that look. It was the same look they gave competitors who underestimated cultural nuance. The press, unaware, kept clapping. Brandon smiled wider, oblivious. Richard leaned forward, grinning like a proud mentor. They believed the show was working, but beneath the surface, cracks were already forming. Back in the cafe, I couldn't stop a bitter laugh from escaping. 16 years of midnight flights, study, and delicate cultural negotiations, replaced by a man who couldn't distinguish between trust and tomato season. My contempt for him burned hotter than my anger at Richard. Richard's betrayal was calculated. Brandon's incompetence was insulting. That afternoon, my phone buzzed. It was an encrypted message from someone inside the legal department, an old ally who still had the courage to whisper in dangerous times. We had to redo the Dubai draft. Brandon's mistake nearly voided half the agreement. Don't worry, we cleaned it up. But this won't be the last time. I stared at the message, equal parts furious and grimly satisfied. They were scrambling already. Brandon's fresh perspective wasn't a bridge. It was a ticking clock. Hours later. I ran into Dana again, this time outside the building as I loaded the last of my belongings into the trunk. "You're better off," she said softly, as though offering comfort. "They'll sink or swim with him. Either way, it's not your fight anymore." Her words stung, but I didn't argue. Out loud, I only said, "You're right." Inside, though, I felt the weight of unfinished business pressing against my chest. Because this was still my fight, not for recognition, but for the principle that trust couldn't be faked and respect couldn't be inherited. As the sun dipped behind the skyline, the company banners inside the glass atrium caught the last orange light. Brandon's face smiled from a glossy poster. The caption beneath him reading "Leading the next chapter." I stood by my car a moment longer, arms crossed, contempt curling through me like smoke. He had no idea that leadership wasn't about speeches or slogans. Leadership was built in silence in the years you spend earning the trust of people who can see through everything else. Brandon could imitate the role, but he could never live it. And deep down, I knew that truth would surface sooner than he or Richard was ready for. The morning after Brandon's shaky debut, I sat at my kitchen table with the cardboard box still unopened beside me. The city moved outside my window, honking horns. Cyclists weaving through traffic, but inside. It felt like the world had narrowed to a single choice: let their betrayal bury me, or face it head on. I reached into the box, pulling out the papers I had tucked away during my rushed exit. The letter from Madrid slid free first, the ink still bold from the night a senior partner had written, "We trust you like family." My fingers lingered on it before setting it aside. Then I unfolded another stack of documents, older, worn at the edges. At the top was Richard Dempsey's signature, unmistakable even in faded ink, and beneath his name, the clause I had crafted years ago stared back at me. It wasn't a flashy clause, to most eyes. It looked like a footnote, a minor technical safeguard, but I remembered every detail of the night I wrote it. We were preparing to expand into regions where contracts lived or died on translation. I had fought to insert language requiring that any cross-border agreement be validated in both languages by me. The original drafter before it could be binding. Richard had waved it through, dismissing it as Laura's obsession with details. He had no idea that what he signed was a lock only I could open. Now, that lock was still intact. My name wasn't a line of ink. It was a key. And without it, every new alliance Brandon and Richard tried to build would crumble the moment the translation came under scrutiny. For the first time since being forced out, I felt my spine straighten. Contempt had kept me bitter. But this was resolve. I wasn't powerless. My work had teeth, and those teeth were still sharp. My phone buzzed with a new message. It was from Elena, a quiet ally in legal, Laura. "The clause you wrote is already causing tension. Dubai asked about your absence. We had to stall. They'll notice sooner than later," I typed a reply, then stopped. If I said too much, it could look like sabotage. If I said nothing, they would walk blind into their own disaster. I chose silence. Sometimes the loudest move is letting the other side play themselves into checkmate. That evening, Dana stopped by my apartment with takeout. She was still trying to be the voice of reason. Between bites of lukewarm noodles, she leaned across the table and said, "Don't get stuck on this. Laura, they've moved on. Maybe you should too. Quiet exits are cleaner." I looked at her, torn between gratitude and frustration. Dana wasn't wrong. Most people in my position would have disappeared, started fresh somewhere else. But most people hadn't built clauses that could topple an empire. Most people hadn't been trusted by Madrid, Dubai, Singapore to carry their words across oceans. I didn't say any of that aloud. Instead, I forced a small smile. "Maybe," I murmured, letting her believe she'd convinced me. But once she left, I pulled the contract closer. tracing my name again and again. Resolve settled deeper in my chest. They could replace my chair, erase my title, stage their false triumphs, but they couldn't erase the structure I had laid down. That foundation still bore my fingerprints. I stacked the papers neatly, slid them back into the box, and closed the lid with steady hands. Isolation had bruised me. Contempt had burned me. But now, resolve was shaping me, and somewhere in the offices I had just left behind, the countdown had already begun. How does this moment make you feel on? What do you think happens next? Share it below. Tap like. And stay with me to the very end of this story. The first cracks didn't roar. They whispered. It began with a single email forwarded to me by an old contact inside legal. The Dubai partners had written to Richard directly. Their words polite but pointed. We request validation from Ms. Laura Price on the final translation of terms. Her role has been integral. Without her review, we cannot confirm reading it. I felt a quiet current of vindication pulse through me. For weeks I had been treated like a ghost, erased from my own work. Yet here it was evidence that I still mattered. Evidence that trust couldn't be handed down like a family heirloom to a nephew in a crisp suit. It had to be earned. But Richard didn't see it that way. According to the same contact, when the letter reached his desk, he brushed it aside. Brandon is more than capable, he declared in a meeting, waving the email like a pesky receipt. We don't need Laura anymore, around the table. Some executives shifted uneasily, but no one challenged him. Power, after all, was theater. And Richard loved to perform. I could almost picture Brandon grinning beside him, nodding along, believing he had the world in his hands. Contempt still simmered in me. But beneath it now lived something sharper, the satisfaction of knowing the Dubai delegation wasn't fooled. They had spent long nights across the table from me, seen me break down complex passages line by line, explaining not just what the words said, but what they meant culturally, politically, legally. Brandon didn't even understand the difference between trust and tomato season. They weren't about to gamble $850 million on him. And yet, if you glanced at the headlines that week, you'd think Nordcrest was unstoppable. The communications team unleashed a flood of press releases. Global alliance nears completion. Fresh leadership drives momentum. Photos of Brandon shaking hands at staged events plastered across financial outlets. Not a hint of doubt in sight. The truth was buried under glossy stock images and well-rehearsed sound bites. From my apartment, I scrolled through the coverage, shaking my head. Vindication is a strange feeling. It doesn't roar like revenge. It hums beneath the noise. Steady and undeniable. I didn't need to shout that they were lying. Dubai's silence in response to the press spoke volumes. The more the media painted success, the more obvious it became that something was missing. That missing piece was me. One evening, as the city lights flickered on outside my window, I received another quiet message, this time from Kareem, a senior Dubai delegate I had worked with for years. Laura, we see the news, but we are not convinced. Why do they pretend you are gone without your validation? Our confidence is at risk. I stared at his words, a mix of warmth and sorrow filling me. He hadn't asked for legal confirmation, he had asked for me, and that distinction mattered. It reminded me that in business, just as in life, trust is personal before it is contractual. Still, I didn't reply. I couldn't, not yet. To step in now would mean shielding Richard and Brandon from the consequences of their arrogance. I folded the message into my thoughts and let the vindication settle deeper. The next morning, another headline blared, Nordcrest secures historic alliance, a lie so bold it almost begged to be exposed. I knew the clock was ticking. They were building their empire on a hollow stage, and sooner or later, the lights would fall away. I closed my laptop slowly, exhaling. Vindication didn't mean victory, not yet, but it was proof that I wasn't invisible, that the bridges I had built still stood, waiting for me on the other side. And Richard Brandon. They hadn't realized yet that ignoring me wasn't erasure, it was invitation. The morning the headlines broke, I almost dropped my coffee. Every major outlet carried the same line. Recycled as if scripted by one hand, Nordcrest secures $850 million global alliance. The articles were glossy, photos crisp, and every quote polished within an inch of its life. Front and center stood Richard and Brandon, shoulder to shoulder, captured mid-laugh. Brandon's tie gleamed under the atrium lights. His smile stretched wide across the front page of a national business magazine. The caption underneath read, "A New Era of Leadership." I stared at it until the words blurred, a dull ache filling my chest. It didn't matter that I knew the truth that Dubai hadn't confirmed, that Madrid was silent, that the contract remained a hollow draft without my validation. To the world, perception was reality, and that reality excluded me entirely. For colleagues still inside Nordcrest, the message was louder than any press release Laura Price had lost. My phone buzzed with notifications, former associates tagging me in articles, some sending quiet condolences. One message stung more than the rest. "I guess they didn't need you after all. Tough break." Laura. It wasn't meant cruelly, but it pierced just the same. 16 years of building bridges across continents, erased with a photograph of a nephew in a suit he didn't deserve. By mid-afternoon, despair had settled heavy, wrapping itself around my shoulders like lead. I wandered my apartment with the magazine still open on the counter, catching glimpses of Brandon's grin each time I passed. The weight of humiliation pressed harder now, transformed into something colder, the fear that maybe this was how history would record it. Maybe my story ended as a footnote in their victory. That evening, the knock at my door startled me. It was Elena, my closest friend still inside Nordcrest's legal department. She looked exhausted. Her hair pulled back hastily, dark circles beneath her eyes. "Laura, I need you to hear me out," she said. Pushing past me with urgency, she set her bag down and pulled out a folder. Papers spilling onto my table. "We're running out of options. Dubai is hesitating. Madrid hasn't signed. If you just sign off, if you validate the translations, it buys us time. It saves jobs. Hundreds, maybe thousands." Her words hit like a blow. I knew she wasn't lying. Behind every failed deal were real people, analysts, assistants, regional staff whose livelihoods dangled from contracts like this. Their security wasn't built on trust clauses. It was built on payroll. And for a flicker of a moment, despair twisted into guilt. But then I saw it. Clearly signing would not save them. It would save Richard and Brandon, handing them the legitimacy they craved. It would validate the farce that had humiliated me. And worse, it would trap me inside it forever. "Elena," I said quietly, forcing calm into my voice, "you think I can rescue this, but I can't. Even if I did, they'd discard me again tomorrow. They'd take the credit, just like they did today. I can't lend my name to a lie." She looked at me, eyes pleading. "So you're just going to let it all burn?" I swallowed hard, my throat tight. "No," I whispered. "I'm going to let the truth speak for itself." For a long moment, neither of us moved. Papers lay scattered between us, silent proof of a company racing toward its own undoing. Finally, Elena gathered them back into her folder, her shoulders slumping. She left without another word, the click of the door echoing like a verdict. I sat alone again, staring at the magazine cover still on the counter. Despair was still there, heavy and suffocating. But underneath it pulsed something faint, almost electric, because if they had to build their triumph on staged photos and empty headlines, it meant they were afraid. It meant the cracks were wider than they dared admit. And despair, I realized, is only the middle of the story. The days that followed felt like living inside a parade I was never meant to join. News outlets wouldn't stop singing Nordcrest's praises. Headlines glowed with certainty. Richard Dempsey's nephew ushers in a bold new era. Brandon's face appeared in glossy spreads, framed by bold type that called him a visionary. Every channel replayed clips of his handshake with Richard beneath the company banners. I kept my distance. I didn't argue online or whisper into the ears of journalists. I watched in silence, scrolling through the coverage late at night, the glow of my laptop casting shadows on the walls. Anticipation coiled in me like a spring, because beneath the glittering surface, I knew something none of them did. The proof had come quietly, almost by accident. An old colleague from operations had sent me a draft for safekeeping, not realizing it still carried my watermark from the original file. As I flipped through it, my breath caught. In the Arabic section, one line was mistranslated. The word that should have anchored the agreement as strategic trust had been written as seasonal commodity. The same error Brandon had made at his public debut had somehow carried into the official draft. And Richard had signed it. I stared at the page until the words blurred, my pulse quickening. My clause, the one they had dismissed as an obsession, required that translations be validated by me to be binding. Without my approval, the contract was already fractured. Their so-called triumph wasn't just fragile, it was doomed. The anticipation that filled me wasn't triumph yet. It was a taut, humming energy, the sense of standing on a cliff edge, waiting for the ground to shift. I knew the partners would catch it sooner or later. When they did, the headlines would invert overnight. Meanwhile, life inside Nordcrest was far less polished than the press suggested. Through whispered updates from sympathetic colleagues, I learned the younger staff weren't convinced by Brandon's act. In the cafeteria and on late-night Slack channels, they called him a figurehead, a puppet propped up for cameras. He's just a placeholder. One of them typed in a message thread that eventually found its way to me. Everyone knows Laura built those bridges. Without her, it's smoke and mirrors. The irony stung and soothed in equal measure. They could see the hollowness, yet they stayed silent, clapping when asked, smiling for photographs, bowing to the theater. That silence was survival, but also complicity. One evening, I sat by the window of my apartment, the city lights twinkling like scattered embers. The magazine with Brandon's grinning face still lay on my coffee table. But now I looked at it differently. It no longer felt like a verdict. It felt like a countdown. Every photograph, every headline, every press release stacked higher on the pyre they had built themselves. Still, anticipation is not peace. My chest tightened with the weight of patience, the gnawing urge to step in, to expose the error immediately, to watch Richard's face crumble under the truth. But I didn't. Not yet. Timing mattered. Letting the illusion swell would make its collapse more devastating. I closed the draft file carefully, sliding it back into the envelope. My name, embedded in the clause, was still the invisible lock on their supposed victory. They might not remember, but the contract did. The law did, and the partners, once they looked closely, would too. That night, I slept lightly, dreams filled with blurred boardrooms and contracts dissolving into dust. I woke before dawn, standing at the window as the river turned silver under the first light. The anticipation still pulsed in my veins, sharper than caffeine, clearer than hope. The world thought Richard and Brandon had won. But I knew the truth. Their victory was only the silence before the storm. The message arrived on a quiet Thursday morning, tucked inside my inbox like any other update. But the subject line froze me mid-breath. Formal notice from Madrid partners. I clicked it open, scanning quickly, my pulse climbing with every line. The letter was brief, decisive, merciless. Without the signature of Ms. Laura Price, the agreement remains invalid. We hereby withdraw our participation in the $850 million alliance. For a long moment, I couldn't move. My hands hovered above the keyboard as if the words themselves might vanish if I blinked too quickly. After months of silence, after headlines and staged celebrations, the first crack had finally broken open, and it wasn't subtle. It was thunder. By mid-afternoon, the dominoes had begun to fall. Singapore's delegation issued a near-identical statement without my validation. The deal held no weight. Hours later, Dubai confirmed the same, referencing translation inconsistencies they could not legally endorse. 3 partners, 3 exits. In less than a day, I wasn't in the room to see Richard's face, but through whispered accounts from colleagues, I pieced it together. He had called an emergency meeting the moment Madrid's letter landed, slamming the printed page onto the table, his voice sharp enough to rattle the glass walls. How the hell did this happen, he demanded, eyes cutting toward the legal team. The lawyers, pale and cornered, reminded him of the clause, the one he had signed years ago, the one requiring my validation on every translation. But Richard refused to hear it. He shouted over them, accusing them of negligence, of incompetence, of failing to anticipate loopholes. Meanwhile, Brandon sat stiff in his chair, his cheeks flushed red. When Richard's rage turned toward him, he lashed out in another direction. It's not legal's fault, he snapped. Communications mishandled the rollout. They oversold the deal before it was airtight. The room dissolved into chaos, fingers pointing, voices clashing, no one willing to shoulder the blame. But the truth was too simple to ignore. Their victory had always been an illusion. And now the illusion was shattering in real time. From my apartment, I watched the stock ticker dip, small at first, then sharper as rumors spread. Reporters caught the scent quickly. Within hours, questions swarmed. Why had 3 key partners pulled out? Why was Laura Price's name appearing in whispers again? The shock that hit Nordcrest rippled outward, shaking not just the company, but the industry watching from the sidelines. Rivals circled like sharks. Investors muttered about broken trust. Employees whispered in hallways, wondering if their jobs would survive the implosion. And me, I sat in silence, staring at the Madrid letter glowing on my laptop screen. The words repeated themselves in my mind, each line carrying the weight of vindication, but also something stranger, heavier. Shock doesn't always come as a blow. Sometimes it comes as release, the sudden realization that the world has shifted in your favor without you lifting a finger. Still, my chest tightened with the magnitude of it. This wasn't just about me anymore. Hundreds of employees were now caught in the fallout. Entire departments would face cuts if the alliance collapsed completely. Part of me wanted to feel triumphant. Instead, I felt the complicated ache of someone who had been both victim and witness to a slow-burning fire, now erupting into flames. By nightfall, financial networks were running segments on the alliance collapse. Footage of Brandon's smiling debut replayed against headlines about withdrawals and mistranslations. Commentators dissected every gesture, every phrase, calling him unprepared, calling Richard reckless. What had once been applause now sounded like mockery. I closed the laptop slowly, the glow fading from my living room. The letters from Madrid, Singapore, and Dubai sat downloaded on my desktop, silent proof of a truth I had carried all along. Shock hummed in my veins, not just at their collapse, but at how fragile their empire had been. All it had taken was one clause, one missing signature, and the trust they had treated like a commodity dissolved overnight. And somewhere inside me, beneath the heaviness, a thought surfaced clear as glass. This was only the beginning. The fallout spread faster than even I had imagined. Within days of Madrid, Singapore, and Dubai pulling out, the press had gone from celebratory to suspicious. Analysts dissected every public statement from Richard, every stumble from Brandon. Yet what cut deepest wasn't speculation, it was evidence. On a Tuesday morning, a financial news anchor leaned forward on camera with the kind of gleeful expression reserved for scandals. "We've uncovered something interesting," she said, pausing for effect. The screen behind her flickered to life, playing an old video clip. It was Richard himself, 5 years younger, standing at a podium during an internal conference, his voice, steady and boastful, carried across the room this clause, designed by our own Laura Price, ensures integrity in every cross-border agreement. Nothing gets signed without her validation. It's airtight. It's why our partners trust us. I nearly dropped the mug in my hand. There it was, the truth, preserved on video, spilling out of Richard's own mouth. I didn't need to defend myself anymore. He had done it for me. The video spread like wildfire, replayed on news channels, embedded in articles, clipped across social media. Headlines sharpened, CEO ignored his own words. Clause praised by Dempsey, Now dooms Nordcrest. Watching it unfold, I felt a strange satisfaction, not the loud, triumphant kind, but a quiet, measured one, like finally exhaling after holding my breath for too long. Inside Nordcrest, the walls shook harder than ever, caught in transcripts of emergency calls. Richard raged at his staff who leaked this. But the truth wasn't a leak. It was history, recorded and waiting for its moment. And that moment had arrived. The shareholders responded next. An emergency meeting was called, and though I wasn't present, colleagues painted the picture, clearly rows of stone-faced investors staring down Richard as the video played on a loop. One of them, an older man who had backed Richard for years, reportedly slammed his fist on the table. "You praised her, you signed it, and now you've sunk us. You shot us in the foot. Richard, and worse, you pulled the trigger yourself, for a man who thrived on control." Richard had lost everything. Brandon sat beside him in silence. His earlier arrogance shriveled into boyish panic. The illusion of leadership had collapsed, leaving only a family name drowning in disgrace. That evening, as I scrolled through the latest updates, a new message appeared in my inbox. It wasn't from a journalist or a colleague, it was from a board member. The email was brief, carefully worded, but its intent was unmistakable. "Laura, there are discussions about restructuring leadership. Your insight and credibility could stabilize Nordcrest. Would you consider a conversation?" I leaned back in my chair, staring at the screen. The irony almost made me laugh. The same company that had escorted me out with a cardboard box was now circling back, desperate for the very stability they had cast aside. My first instinct was to delete the message, to let them drown in the mess they created. But I didn't. I saved it, letting the quiet satisfaction wash over me. Restraint mattered now. Too much gloating, too much rage, and I would risk becoming what they had been: careless, short-sighted, arrogant. No, this victory wasn't about noise. It was about presence, about letting them realize in silence how much they had underestimated me. As the city lights flickered outside my apartment window, I poured a glass of water and raised it slightly. Not in a toast, but in acknowledgement. The board, the investors, the partners, they had all seen the truth with their own eyes. Richard had handed me my vindication years ago when he praised the clause on record. All I had done was wait. Satisfaction doesn't always come with cheers. Sometimes it comes in the quiet, when the world finally catches up to what you knew all along. And I knew this: their story was crumbling, and mine was only beginning. The week after the old video resurfaced, Nordcrest was already teetering, but chaos has a way of snowballing. And this time, it didn't roll quietly, it thundered. Richard tried to salvage what little credibility he had left, with Brandon at his side. He scheduled a private call with the 3 partners who had withdrawn. Madrid, Singapore, and Dubai all appeared on the screen, their faces sharp, their patience thin. Richard leaned forward, hands folded, his voice pitched in its most diplomatic register. "We can work through this," he insisted. "The alliance is too important for all of us. The clause in question was an oversight, a technicality. Let's move past it." For a heartbeat, there was silence. Then the Madrid delegate shook his head slowly. His words landed like hammer strikes. "We only sign with Laura Price." Richard's jaw tightened. He tried again, offering concessions, discounts, additional guarantees. Nothing moved them. The Singapore representative finally cut in. Her tone clipped. "Your company's credibility was built on her validation. Without it, there is nothing left to negotiate." The call ended abruptly. Richard's face flushed with fury as the screens went black. But the worst wasn't the rejection. It was what Brandon did next. In a frantic attempt to prove his worth, he composed an email to the partners. The subject line was bold: "Desperate resolution to clause issue." In the body, he wrote that Nordcrest would correct the bilingual clause, adjust the signatures, and move forward without delay. He even offered to resend documents with appropriate changes, as if altering legal agreements retroactively was a minor edit. The partners didn't respond with relief. They responded with legal threats. Within hours, Nordcrest's inbox was flooded with notices questioning Brandon's email as evidence of attempted fraud. One line from Dubai's lawyers cut deepest. This constitutes bad faith and deliberate misrepresentation. We are evaluating litigation. Chaos erupted inside Nordcrest's headquarters. Executives sprinted between meetings. Lawyers scrambled to draft explanations. And communications staff tried to stem the bleeding with frantic press statements. Richard's shouts echoed down hallways, bouncing off glass walls like gunfire. Employees whispered in corners, unsure whether to laugh, cry, or polish their resumes. The board convened again in emergency session, this time more divided than ever. One faction argued that the only way forward was to bring me back. Laura is the only credible face left, one director declared, slamming a fist against the table. If she validates the agreements, the partners will return. But the other side bristled, more loyal to the Dempsey family than to the company's survival. Bringing her back undermines Richard completely. Another retorted, it signals to the market that leadership failed. The room split in half, survival versus loyalty, truth versus pride. The shouting grew so intense that even junior staff outside the boardroom could hear the arguments spilling through the walls. From afar, I followed every leak and headline, the details relayed by quiet allies still inside. The irony was sharp enough to make me laugh. They had tried to erase me, to prove I was replaceable. Now their survival hinged on my return. And they couldn't even agree whether to swallow their pride long enough to admit it. Meanwhile, Brandon's email became the centerpiece of chaos. News outlets obtained copies, publishing excerpts under blistering headlines. Nordcrest accused of tampering with contracts. Commentators debated whether fraud charges might stick. Analysts speculated about shareholder lawsuits. The stock price plummeted in real time, dragging retirement funds and employee savings down with it. And still, Richard refused to step aside. He stormed through the office, barking at subordinates, insisting he could still fix it. Brandon trailed behind him, pale and silent. The smug confidence drained from his face. Chaos has a sound, phones ringing off the hook, printers spitting nonstop, voices colliding in panic, but it also has a silence, the quiet certainty that no matter how loud they screamed, no matter how hard they scrambled, the collapse had already begun. From my apartment, I read the latest reports and closed my laptop with steady hands. Their empire was unraveling, thread by thread, pulled by their own arrogance, and though the chaos swirled like a storm, I didn't need to lift a finger. The invitation arrived quietly, with none of the fanfare Nordcrest usually attached to its meetings. A simple email, subject line, request for attendance, emergency board session. I stared at it for a long time, weighing whether to delete it or answer. They hadn't asked me back out of respect. They had asked me back because they had no other choice. Still, curiosity pulled me in. 2 hours later, I walked into the glass tower I once called home. Security didn't stop me. My name was still in their system. The lobby buzzed with nervous energy assistants whispering, executives pacing. The collapse had spread panic like smoke, filling every corner. The boardroom was already packed when I entered, every seat taken, every wall lined with advisors. At the far end of the long table, screens glowed with the faces of our international partners. Madrid, Singapore, Dubai. I felt every gaze land on me as I stepped inside. And then it happened. Laura, the Madrid delegate said warmly, inclining his head. At last, good to see you again, added the representative from Singapore, smiling faintly. Even Dubai, usually so guarded, leaned forward. We wondered when you would join us. Not a single greeting was offered to Richard, not one acknowledgement of Brandon, who sat stiffly in his chair beside his uncle. Their smiles faltered, the silence around them heavy with humiliation. Authority, I realized, wasn't something you claimed. It was something others gave you freely. And in that moment, it was mine. Richard cleared his throat, trying to wrestle the room back under his control. "We're here to resolve misunderstandings," he began, his voice tight, but before he could continue, the Singapore delegate raised a hand. "There is no misunderstanding," she said flatly. "We will sign only with Laura Price. Or not at all." The room froze. Advisors scribbled frantically. Board members shifted in their seats, some triumphant, others visibly furious. Richard's face darkened, the thin line of his mouth betraying years of entitlement unraveling. Then Brandon broke, his voice rising sharp. "This is sabotage. She's been working against us from the start, feeding doubts, planting stories. How else would the clause resurface? She wants us to fail." The accusation hung in the air. But before I could answer, one of the board members tapped a button on the console. The screen behind him flickered, and Brandon's infamous email appeared in bold font resolution to clause issue. The words scrolled across the massive screen, each line damning. "We will correct the bilingual clause. We will resend documents with appropriate changes." The room gasped as the email played out in full. "This," the board member said icily, "is what the partners call fraud." Not Laura's silence. Brandon's face drained of color. He stammered, but nothing coherent came out. Richard barked his name, but it only made him shrink further in his chair. Every eye turned back to me. I didn't gloat. I didn't raise my voice. I simply folded my hands on the table and spoke evenly. "I didn't sabotage Nordcrest. I built the framework that made you credible. You chose to ignore it. You tried to erase me. And this," I gestured toward the frozen email on the screen, "is the result of arrogance. Not sabotage." Silence followed, deep and decisive. For the first time in months, I wasn't defending myself. I was setting the terms. A faction of the board nodded subtly, some leaning forward, as if already aligning behind me. Others still clung to Richard, their loyalty written on their scowling faces. The division was clear, the stakes laid bare. But for the partners on the screens, there was no division. Their stance was unanimous. Madrid spoke again, his voice calm but ironclad. "Our condition remains. We sign with her or not at all." Authority surged through me, then not loud, not boastful, but undeniable. It was in the way the board leaned toward me, the way the partners addressed me, the way Richard sat speechless at the far end of the table. A man stripped of command. I left the room that day, not with a contract, not with a title, but with something more powerful, the quiet certainty that the future no longer belonged to them. It belonged to me. The collapse wasn't a single moment. It was a series of quiet concessions that built into inevitability. By the end of the month, the $850 million alliance was officially dead. Every headline carried the same refrain: Nordcrest leadership fails to secure partners. For Richard, it was the end of his reign. The board forced his resignation in a closed-door session. The announcement delivered with no ceremony. Brandon followed within hours, his departure cloaked in the vague language of personal reasons. Their empire, once so loudly paraded, fell apart in whispers. I watched from the back of the boardroom as it unfolded. No one escorted me out this time. No one placed a cardboard box on the table. The silence around me felt different now, not erasure, but acknowledgement. I had become the constant they could no longer deny. The following morning, a courier arrived at my apartment with an envelope embossed with Madrid's seal. Inside, a letter written in a hand I recognized instantly. "Laura, we do not abandon alliances. We simply change who leads them. Build a new framework, and we will stand behind you. This time, your name will be at the top." I read it 3 times, the weight of it settling deep in my chest. It wasn't just an offer, it was validation, the kind that couldn't be spun by headlines or silenced by family ties. For years, I had been the hidden architect, the translator, the bridge. Now they were asking me to stand at the front. And yet, doubt whispered, was returning to the same battlefield worth it? The thought of stepping back into Nordcrest's ruins carried its own dangers: old loyalties, bitter factions, scars that might never fade. The alternative, though, shimmered with possibility to create something of my own, built not on borrowed power, but on trust and clarity. That night, I spread the Madrid letter across my kitchen table beside my old notebooks, pages filled with translations, annotations, margins scribbled during sleepless nights in hotel rooms. I traced the lines, remembering the exhaustion, the sacrifices, the relentless pursuit of perfection. For the first time in months, the memories didn't sting. They steadied me. By the time dawn crept across the city, I had made peace with my decision. I didn't need a CEO's chair or a glossy magazine cover. I needed a platform where dignity came first, where the respect I'd fought for wasn't treated like a commodity, whether that meant building a rival firm or launching a consultancy with my own name above the door. I knew one thing for certain: the partners would follow. Later that week, I returned to Nordcrest one final time. The boardroom, once so suffocating, felt smaller now. Papers littered the table, voices low, the atmosphere thick with exhaustion. As I gathered the last of my belongings, I caught my reflection in the glass wall. No bitterness, no fear, just a quiet smile. I walked out not as the woman escorted away with a cardboard box, but as the woman who had endured, who had waited, and who now held the leverage they could never reclaim. The lobby doors opened to the city beyond, the sun bright against the pavement. For the first time, I stepped through them feeling entirely free, because the truth was simple power had never belonged to a chair, a title, or a family name. It belonged to trust, to respect, to the kind of authority others grant you willingly, not the kind you declare. And that was mine. Sometimes triumph doesn't roar. Sometimes it arrives quietly, steady as breath, serene as a sunrise after the longest night. Now share your thoughts in the comments, like if my journey resonates with you, and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. Let's see how many of us still believe in faith as the truest form of power.